Hi everyone, we're going to be starting Secret Garden. So let's start with Chapter 1, A New Life. Mary Lennox gazed through the train window at the dark gray sky. It was raining hard, and the heavy raindrops pelted loudly against the window as the train rumbled across the English countryside. Staring out at the rainstorm, Mary frowned. She didn't particularly like sitting in a damp, musty train. Nor did she like having to travel with Mrs. Medlock, the unpleasant old woman sent to take care of Mary on the journey to Misselthwaite Manor. More than anything, however, Mary didn't like having to come here to England to live with her strange uncle, a man she had never even met. Mary watched as the train cruised past tiny villages and trees. Everything looked so foreign and strange. It wasn't anything like India, where Mary had lived her whole life. The sky, so gray and dark, seemed to fit Mary's unpleasant mood. Mary sighed loudly and sat back in her seat. She turned away from the window and stole a glance at Mrs. Medlock, who was lost in her own thoughts. Mary could tell by Mrs. Medlock's sour expression that she was not happy about having to take care of her. Nobody had ever wanted to take care of Mary. Though Mary grew up in a grand palace in India with hundreds of servants, she had been alone most of the time. In fact, Mary rarely ever saw her parents. Her father worked for the English government and was too concerned with his work to pay any attention to her. Mary's mother was young and beautiful and cared more about attending parties than spending time with her daughter. Mary was raised by a nanny, or ayah, as she called her. Her ayah tended to her every day, cooking for her, cleaning up after her, even dressing her. Now 9 years old, Mary didn't even know how to dress herself. Mary grew to have a terrible temper. She ordered her servants and her ayah around so much that nobody could stand to be near her. It wasn't long before Mary grew from a spoiled baby to a spoiled, ill-tempered child who almost never smiled. Because of this, Mary didn't have any friends at all. One winter morning, her ayah did not come to wake and dress her. Later, Mary learned that her ayah had passed away from a terrible sickness. Within days, that sickness spread across India, killing many people, including Mary's parents. Left all alone in the world, she would have to be sent to live with her uncle, Lord Archibald Craven, at Misselthwaite Manor in England. Mary traveled by boat to England, where Mrs. Medlock met her at the train station. Mrs. Medlock looked very disappointed when she saw the young girl. "Such a plain, frail child," she remarked to a conductor, loud enough for Mary to hear. "We had heard her mother was a beauty. She didn't hand much of it down, did she?" Mary didn't care too much for Mrs. Medlock either. She had a stern, sour face and wore dark clothes. Mary hoped everyone else in England wasn't as unpleasant. The train slowed to a stop, and Mrs. Medlock turned to Mary and spoke, interrupting Mary's thoughts. "I suppose I may as well tell you something about where you are going," she said flatly. "Do you know anything about your uncle?" Mary shook her head. "No," she replied. "Your father and mother never spoke of him?" Mrs. Medlock asked in surprise. "No," Mary said again. Her parents had never talked to her about anything in particular. Mrs. Medlock seemed shocked. "Well, I suppose you might as well be told something, so you'll be prepared," she said. "You are going to a very strange place." Mary said nothing and stared out the train window as she listened to Mrs. Medlock describe Misselthwaite Manor. The manor was very old, almost 600 years old. It was huge, too, like a castle. It had nearly 100 rooms. But the strange thing about the manor, Mary thought, was something called the moor. Mrs. Medlock said it surrounded Misselthwaite Manor for miles and miles. "Most of the rooms in the house are shut and locked up," Mrs. Medlock told Mary. "You'll have your space to play about and look after yourself, but you'll be warned which rooms to stay away from. There are many gardens, too. Some of them are kept up rather nicely. Outside, you may go wherever you please, but in the house, you mustn't ever go poking about." "I won't," Mary started. "As for your uncle," Mrs. Medlock continued, "he's not going to trouble himself with you, that's for sure. He never troubles himself with anyone. In fact, he's out of the country now and will probably be gone for quite a while." Mrs. Medlock waited for Mary to ask more about her uncle, but Mary just continued to stare out the window. "He's got a crooked back," Mrs. Medlock went on, "and until he married your aunt, he was a sour young man with a lot of money. They were very happy together. Then, when she died—" Mary spun around in her seat and looked at Mrs. Medlock. "She died?" Mary asked. "Yes," Mrs. Medlock replied. and it made Lord Craven stranger than ever. He didn't want to see anybody, and he still doesn't. Most of the time, he just goes away. When he's at the manor, he shuts himself up in the west wing and doesn't let anybody see him. Mary turned back to the train window and watched the rain again. She wished she were back in India. At least in India there had been no strange uncles or bitter old caretakers. Mary watched the rain until her eyes grew heavy. She fell asleep to the patter of the raindrops against the pane.